Good afternoon, class. This is John checking in. This will probably be our last screencast of the quarter. Just get a little misty-eyed hearing myself say that. No, but in all sincerity, good luck to you as you put the finishing touches on this quarter, both for this class and your others. So today, many of you were in class and will recall that we were talking about a critical moment in early modern Chinese history, where we were looking at the changes that are happening between the Tang Empire and the Sung Empire, and particularly a commercial revolution that transforms China during the Tang Dynasty. And in some respects, this commercial revolution is going to help explain the tremendous success that China will be experiencing for the next 500 years or so of Chinese society. There will be other dynasties that follow the Tang, and many of them will utilize some of the economic successes that China stumbles upon during the Tang Dynasty. So I'm just going to click through here. If you need to shore up your notes at all, feel free to do that. I've fixed some of these slides. I apologize for this one. You'll notice that I did insert the Grand Canal into this picture, or rather into this slide. And I spoke to pretty much all of these comments earlier in class. Let me just briefly touch upon the disturbances here, because as you'll know, the story or the narrative that we are pursuing in my comments today is how does the rather strict bureaucratic regulatory government that China demonstrates during the Tang Empire, how is its grip loosened? How does it lighten up in terms of the regulation, supervision, and management that it offers? And that story is really, not surprisingly, one that has a historical explanation. And in trying to put the finishing touches on my comments for this part of today's lecture, I wanted you to appreciate, and I think I skipped over this, but I wanted you to appreciate how the Tang Dynasty was left with few alternatives, largely because both the external and internal challenges that it faced in the mid-8th century. It created a decentralization of power, and you'll notice here the regional commanders. So in an effort to put down some of the threats that were occurring to China, based largely due to her northern neighbors, like the Jurchen and then other nomadic warrior societies, regional commanders were absolutely important. So China was relying upon remote corners of the Tang civilization to amass and assemble to help put down these outside threats. And once those outside threats were finally reduced, there was power that had been extended. China had relied upon remote corners of the Tang Empire to put down this threat, and that wasn't forgotten, and this is oftentimes the case. The power that these commanders discovered in the process of putting down outside forces were not immediately left. These commanders stayed in place, and as a result, the power of the Tang was decentralized and shared with the outermost reaches. I spoke about the market reforms in some detail in class, and so I'll leave those as such, but I do want to just briefly say that this picture that I'm showing here is in some ways maybe confusing. This is meant to portray how sort of the scholar officials of the Tang Dynasty were treated, and really an important center of power and authority within Chinese society. These scholar officials were the most educated, learned members of Tang era society, and they were given the opportunities to enter into the ranks of government as bureaucrats and officials. So what you see on the left here, these market reforms are in many ways going to elevate merchants to a place of greater power. And that elevation of the merchants is going to come, not completely, but in many ways at the expense of this class of scholar officials, or sometimes known as the scholar gentry. These are the people who've memorized all the Confucian classics, they've written their essays, and they're staffing, or they were staffing, the once significant Tang era bureaucracy. That bureaucracy is going to shrink significantly during the Tang Dynasty, largely at the expense of a growing merchant class. So here's where we left off, and I pardon these images are perhaps a little bit graphic, and it might be also further interesting that they are so contemporary, meaning they're so like modern from the present. But one of the really clear ways in which the commercial revolution impacted the lives of everyday people is during the Tang Dynasty. There's a tremendous upheaval of the sources of power within Chinese society. It'll help you to think, in the mid-12th century, Tang era China is going to be essentially invaded by nomadic warrior tribes from the north, and the Jurchen are a key group, a key society that enacts this transformation of Chinese society. Because what we'll start to see is a dramatic sort of internal migration of China, where people are going to be moving from the north, relocating to the south of China. So it'd be a little bit like if suddenly all the people from New England and the eastern Atlantic seaboard suddenly migrated to California. You would probably notice a dramatic change, because some of those people who had established property and an aristocratic name in early American history would suddenly be forced to sort of start over, and they would be kind of entering the bottom rung by virtue of having to start their lives over in California. That's kind of what happened in China, in this north to south shift. And so what we see is some of the older, powerful governmental, military aristocrats of the north, they're being pushed south by these warrior nomads in the north, and this creates some real challenges. So merchants are they've already in some ways become a powerful part of this class, but I mean part of this Tang Dynasty, but they're going to become even more important, particularly in the context of the internal disruptions and the starting over. On the last slide, we talked about market reforms, and we know that different regions within China are going to become specializing in different things, and I have examples here of shipbuilding to accommodate the growing maritime trade, printing, which is done largely as woodblock printing. This is going to be a helpful way that contributes to the more easy, readily education of various members of Chinese society. Textile, ceramics, iron. And also, Buddhism is going to be a pretty central part of this commercial revolution. We know that in the Tang capital of Chang'an, there was quite a bit of an emphasis upon accommodating foreigners, both missionaries, monks, and merchants. The maritime trade, again, we mentioned this earlier, but one of the ways in which this transforms things is it's going to increase, it's going to grow the economy by almost 1/5, just due to these additional markets that are going on outside of China. And as China discovers these nearby and distant foreign markets, they're going to be bringing in luxury goods, things that previously were unknown to many members of Chinese society. In terms of how this affects the lives of everyday people, it's going to be beneficial in minor ways, in the sense that these people will have access to a greater number of goods. And because of the greater commercial activity, the typical person will have greater employment that gives them sort of a greater, higher standard of living. But we shouldn't overstate this, because once you get below the merchant class, still the overwhelming majority of Chinese people were, agricultural. They were living off the land. They were growing rice and growing fruits, maybe growing tea, so on and so forth. So it's not terribly dramatic. But let me talk just briefly about this phenomenon of foot binding. So when the Jurchen conquer northern China in the mid-12th century, as I mentioned already, there's going to be a real north-south migration and the rural-urban divides, whereas the south had sort of been the kind of rural agricultural crop-producing segment of China for a couple centuries or several centuries before. Now, because people are crowding into the south, there's going to be a real complication of like social group identity and so on and so forth. Foot binding, oddly enough, began at the tail end of the Tang Dynasty, but it starts to become much more widespread during the Tang Dynasty and later dynasties. And it's based upon a prevailing cultural ideal of beauty within China. And the idea was that many elite men sort of developed sort of an obsession or fetish with a small female foot. And so the practice of foot binding is actually a real challenge for a lot of our modern sensibilities. Girls as young as age 3 or 4 would have their feet essentially lashed and tightly bound together with long strips of silk, so that they were held against the possibility of growing larger. And in time, the arch of the foot would break, and you can kind of see how the toes were wrapped under, the small toes were wrapped under the big toe to create this pointed looking foot. And this practice really continued with some regularity right up to 1911. And anyway, this was an effort by families of more modest families. They called it marital bait. It was a way of sort of attracting the aristocrats, many of whom were relocating from the north, in a way that they could marry off their daughters to perhaps an upwardly social mobile. It was an act of upward social mobility to move both their daughter and their family up the ranks. So this is one way in which social categories were impacted. So the differing political structures, and this is kind of serves as a summary, but the ways in which the Tang Dynasty government enabled the conditions of the commercial revolution to take place is they were, for one, much more decentralized. The Tang Empire was forced to sort of release its control and its regulatory presence, and this created some opportunities for greater commerce. By the Tang era, government was more limited. It was limited to things like simply having superintendents. These were government agents that would oversee trade at a select number of international port cities, most of which were in the south of China. The government oversaw the paper currency, which is an important role of government, but even this role of government had as its consequence the improvement of the greater efficiency of moving product, because paper money was so much more easy to work with and so much more transferable. The government did less in terms of controlling trade and mostly just settled for collecting taxes on the transactions that happened as a result of trade, and thus there was sort of a mutually beneficial relationship. Government was relatively relaxed in terms of its regulation, but it was able to create greater revenues from taxes as a result of that increase in economic activity. And when the Tsung were conquered by the Jurchen in the early 12th century, that was really the defining moment that created challenges for the Tsung, the northern Sung Empire. But as people were pushed south, it created additional opportunities. And so in some ways it was a classic study in sort of the Taoism, if you remember the story of the farmer's luck, that when adversity struck, maybe it was bad luck, but also maybe it created opportunities that would be born out of that unfortunate circumstance. And that's perhaps a helpful way of thinking about the changes that happened commercially to the Tang Dynasty as a result of its misadventures or mishaps at the hands of the Northern Jurchen. So with that, we'll stop. Thank you.